Hello everyone. Today our discussion is about decarbonization and its role in driving climate action. As we all know, climate change is one of the greatest issues that we have at the present moment. Today we have the privilege to speak with Don Sandev Ferdinando, carbon consultant at Serendib Assets, to explore how we all can contribute for more sustained and resilient future. Our goal today is not just to understand strategies and challenges of decarbonization, but also to empower and encourage people to contribute for more sustainable future. So Don, to start off, what initially motivated you to go to the field of decarbonization?
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me here today. So my background is in economics, actually. I was really not interested in the environment, but I was studying under a climate scientist in Singapore. That's where I completed my undergraduate education. And I realized quite soon that the climate change problem is really an economics problem as well. So I was able to utilize my economic kind of theoretical understanding and take that to a climate change perspective. So I think once I made that link, I was very determined to uncover both the climate science element of it, but also identify how companies are decarbonizing, how governments are decarbonizing, and to really identify the strong financial and economic role in that topic. I think, so my background, or how I would identify myself, is as an environmental economist. I had not come across a lot of individuals, especially in the global south or in Sri Lanka, who have this interdisciplinary approach. So I think Sri Lanka is a perfect place to apply these skills. And so that's initially what got me into this field.
It's nice to know those stuff. So I want to know, how do you define decarbonization and why it is critical in fight against climate change?
Right. So decarbonization is the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, GHG emissions. So this includes methane, carbon dioxide, SF6, your gases under the Montreal Protocol. So decarbonization involves strategies or projects that would reduce or avoid these emissions, the emitting of these emissions. And in regards to climate change, so climate change is a greenhouse gas problem. We have climate change because our GHG emissions have increased substantially when you're comparing to pre-industrial levels. So that is the benchmark that we use when we're comparing increase in emissions. The Earth's system is able to only accommodate so much of these emissions, so it's something called tipping points. You have tipping points in the biological sense, you have tipping points when it comes to emissions. So right now we are just below 1.5 degrees Celsius warming compared to pre-industrial levels. And the UN or the IPCC has set a target of 2 degrees warming. So that is our theoretical cap that we should not exceed, because beyond this we would, in theory, exceed our this tipping point that I spoke of. So you can think of it like a spring, right? A spring, if you keep pulling it, at some point it'll come back to its original shape. But if it keeps going further than that, it's going to be stuck. You're not going to be able to bring it back. So in the same way with the climate change problem, if we go past 1.5, go past 2 degrees Celsius, there is there's strong scientific research to show that we're going to go beyond this tipping point and not be able to come back to where we were. So the fight against climate change is really a problem of how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
So now let's talk about some experiences and insights. So can you share any key experience or insight that have shaped your understanding of climate action, and especially in Sri Lanka or in this global context?
Right. So I'll start off where I left off previously, studying under the climate change scientist in Singapore. Following that interaction, I was really interested in the climate governance space. So soon after, working with this climate scientist, I began to look towards the UNFCCC negotiation. So this is the annual climate change conferences that happen in various cities across the world. So through my university, the National University of Singapore, I joined the COP25 and COP26 conferences in Madrid and Glasgow. So this was to really understand, what are countries, what are companies discussing at these climate change conferences. Sometimes you can have, 50,000, 80,000 delegates that attend, and you have all the heads of state who go. So this is really the primary meeting place to discuss climate change. So I have attended that with NUS, and I've attended COP28 in Dubai with the government of Sri Lanka. So this is purely to discuss the financing mechanisms of this problem to decrease greenhouse gases. So my area of expertise is specifically on something called Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. What this is simply the new carbon trading mechanism that the United Nations is putting out. And governments and companies are coming together to discuss and negotiate what this new mechanism would entail. So I've been closely following and closely monitoring these discussions. Actually, the next climate change conference is next week in Baku, Azerbaijan. So again, the Sri Lankan delegation will be sending a few people there. Aside from the negotiations perspective, I've also worked in the financial services industry. So I was working at a bank in Singapore as well as in Qatar with their sustainability team. So this was more on the company side of things, slightly different to the government perspective, where you're looking at policies to reduce your emissions or to have projects that would conserve your emissions or water usage. So from the banking perspective, it was quite interesting because you're also looking at the impact of the financing that you give out. So let's say you were to distribute a loan, what are the embedded emissions or future emissions that will come as a result of that, right? So do you want to put your money, do you want to give a loan to someone for a coal plant, or do you want to give a loan to someone to start a renewable energy project? So there was also that quantification where from a banker's perspective, we need to analyze the sustainability strategy of the companies we're giving out loans to. We need to maybe help our clients build new strategies, because what's happening is a lot of companies have net zero targets and mandates to reduce their emissions. So as a bank, we also need to be responsible with who we give these, financing options to. And secondly, what we also look at is the targets of the companies and how well they have done to meet these targets. So through that, we're able to structure sustainable finance mechanisms. So as a very simple example, rather than giving you an interest rate at 5%, if you have done A, B, C, D to meet your sustainability goals as a company, as a manufacturing firm, let's say, I can give you a loan at 4%, at 3%. So that is how, from a banking perspective, we would approach that. Similarly, with the sustainability teams, we were also looking at ESG quite closely. So, as a bank and with our clients, how do we make sure that we're meeting ESG targets? How do we work with the National Stock Exchange to make sure that public listed companies are meeting their mandatory requirements to meet these ESG targets? So that's another perspective. And I would say a third perspective was also on the policy side. So prior to coming to Sri Lanka now to join Serendib Assets, where I work, I was also with Sri Lanka's permanent mission to the United Nations in New York. So I was working there for a couple of months with one of the ambassadors covering sustainability and economic topics. So we would attend meetings, briefings to identify what discussions are going on, report that back to the permanent mission. And if the government needs to take an official position, then we would discuss from there on. So I think that was a very interesting perspective because I got to see how the government of Sri Lanka negotiates in these international forums and what the government of Sri Lanka's priorities are as well. Because again, we have only so many officers, only so many resources to distribute. So we're not able to attend every single meeting. We're not able to give our input to every single topic, but the government has certain priorities that we have established through various policy documents. So these are some of the issues you will see government officials discussing at either the COPs that I mentioned or at the UN. So yeah, these are some of the experiences that I think have really shaped my both understanding, interest, and knowledge in this space. And I think something very cool that just happened last year, actually, it was following on from this Article 6 of the Paris Agreement that I spoke about, this new UN mechanism, the idea is that governments will enter into bilateral discussions and an agreement to trade carbon credits. So right now, if we're both a company, you can buy carbon credits from me and vice versa. But for this new Article 6 mechanism, you need government-to-government agreements. So I actually was on the team to broker our agreement with the government of Singapore. So after I graduated, I had some contacts in Singapore. I connected them with our presidential secretariat here and the climate change secretariat here. And now we have the Article 6 MOU with Singapore that was released last August. I'm not sure if you came across that. So this is one step in the government of Sri Lanka being able to issue carbon credits. And we're looking to sign with a few other countries, hopefully. But yeah, these are some of the, I would say, highlights that I've had the pleasure and honor of working on. Yeah.
So now it's time to talk about challenges and barriers. What do you think are the main challenges in developing countries when establishing decarbonization? And how have similar barriers been overcome in other parts of the countries?
So to answer your question, I would say one word is risk. That is the main kind of barrier to overcome when it comes to decarbonization. Not just risk from looking at what the government is doing, but also when you're analyzing company strategies, decarbonization strategies. The primary word is risk, I would say. In Sri Lanka specifically, we have economic risk, social risk, financial risk, currency, foreign exchange risk, a plethora of issues when it comes to this. So, for example, to give you one example of forex risk, during the crisis in Sri Lanka, the CEB halted or delayed some payments to renewable energy providers or to independent power providers. So what happens is, if you're receiving investment in US dollars and you're expecting payment in Sri Lankan rupees, and you have a fluctuation of the currency, and B, you have a problem where the CEB doesn't pay you on time, no one is going to come to Sri Lanka to take an equity stake in a renewable energy project. So that's one risk. Economic risk, financial risk is evident. Governance risk as well, right? There's a risk of appropriation, where the government of Sri Lanka can say, okay, now I own this project that you spent your money and time to build. The government can just take it, and they have done that before. There's also social risk of, let's say, the community not wanting to adopt this new project that is there. One example might be the Manar wind farm that Adani is trying to do. They're going through some legal challenges, primarily through disruption from grassroots level organizations. So that's another example. I think when it comes to the financial, economic, and forex risk, there are some mechanisms to overcome this. There are insurance products that you can use, especially for carbon trading. You can also hedge carbon trading. So let's say I'm going to deliver carbon credit 100 units of carbon credits in 2027. I can guarantee the payment for you now. So we can enter into a forward contract. So there's ways to hedge an instrument as well. It's commonly used in financial markets. So there are methods to go about that, but it's expensive to do. And I think with Sri Lanka, given the governance and economic risk as well, investment firms might have a higher let's say, risk premium that they add on top because of where this project is taking place. So what happens is, in a traditional transaction, the risk determinant is primarily, okay, can you pay this money back, right? But with an environmental project, the risk, or the main question you're asking yourself is, will this project deliver the environmental outcomes and benefits it says it will? So the risk profile and the questions you ask yourself are slightly different. So there are mechanisms, again, to reduce this premium. But specifically in the context of Sri Lanka, that is the number one problem. Number two, I would say, is a project pipeline. So the Colombo Stock Exchange recently announced their $50 million green bond program. They don't have, or they are currently developing their project pipeline. It's not just ready yet. Our central bank has a sustainable finance roadmap. If you read the report, they will say that the primary challenge is implementation. They have the taxonomy, they have the structure, but the implementation strategies are lacking. So I think that's another strong component. So that's where we come in as a project developer. Serendib Assets, what we do is we develop these projects, and then we work with the private sector, we work with the government, we work with foreign investors to make it happen, right? So that's another element. And I would say another challenge might be probably developing a comprehensive project that would include all stakeholders with multiple benefits. So rather than your only benefit being the environmental outcomes, how do you ensure biodiversity protection? How do you ensure social protections in this project design? So that's another element I might say. What other countries are doing they're coming up with new financing instruments to get around these challenges. So one example is in South Africa with the World Bank. They have come up with a outcome-based bond to protect rhinos. So what happens is you raise $150 million, 10 million of those dollars go towards protecting rhinos. If the rhino population were to increase by 2%, the bond holder would receive an increased payout based on the increase in rhino population. So again, what you're doing is you're moving the risk profile, you're changing what the risk is based on. It's not purely financial considerations, but you're looking at environmental and biodiversity considerations. Very similar programs have been done in Vietnam, a water bond. Indonesia, I believe right now, is looking at a similar structure, as well as Brazil. So there are mechanisms out there. I think what Sri Lanka needs to do to overcome these risks and to overcome this image that we might have in the world is to say, or to really understand how we can create a conducive investment environment to attract this financing to Sri Lanka. Because again, Sri Lanka, we're only a population of 22 million people, a tiny economy. Actually, I don't mean anything by this, but we're relevant in the global world, right? We need to bring people here. People are not looking for us. We need to go out there and bring people here, right? I think Sri Lanka has a lot to offer in terms of its natural wealth, in terms of its environment and its beauty. And I think it's just a matter of how do we get investors and foreign governments to see what we know is here, so that we can address and overcome all these risks. Because right now, if anyone hears the word Sri Lanka anywhere, it's a hassle, it's a pain, it's too much paperwork to do, right? So when we go out there and we represent the government at these conferences, we need to have that in mind. We need to know how to speak to investors. We need to know how to speak in in financial terms. So yeah, I would say these are some of the risks and ways that we could overcome it. Yeah.
Okay, so now if we talk about role of sustained finance when it comes to decarbonization, how critical it is in helping Sri Lanka and achieving its climate goals, and what financing mechanisms do you think could work best here?
Right. So to follow on from my previous answer on risk, it is sustainable finance mechanisms that can overcome that primary challenge. Without it, you're not going to overcome or mitigate this risk through traditional finance alone. Just to give you a sense of what the government's targets and policies are, the Climate Prosperity Plan under the previous government was to request for, or it set a policy target of around $26 billion for our renewable energy uptake. So this includes not just solar and wind, but also debt for nature swaps and other mechanisms. No one is going to give Sri Lanka $26 billion or the grant amount that they were asking for. Neither do we have a way of channeling those funds through our banking system. So we need to come up with mechanisms to attract that financing. And you also cannot expect the government to put up, 20, 30, 40% of that 26 billion ask, you do need to, again, leverage these mechanisms to reach your target. Sri Lanka does have a target of 100% renewable energy production. We are part of the Climate Vulnerable Forum group. And by 2030, we also have a target of 70% renewable energy 70% renewable energy target. So to meet this is quite a tall order because the timeline is not that far. We have about five years now to achieve that. And currently Sri Lanka has around 55% to 60% renewable energy in its mix. What Sri Lanka does is we import coal, oil, fossil fuels. We spend $4.9 billion a year on importing that. Each coal shipment costs $50 million approximately. Yet we have power cuts, yet we have so many issues, right? So what we are proposing in terms of going about this renewable energy transition is, how do you direct the money that would have gone towards imports of these fossil fuels towards renewable energy uptake? And what are the cost savings that would come out of that? So these are some of I would say, the numbers we're trying to put together to really determine and to provide a case for why we should do this now. Secondly, I think on the question of the mechanisms, one mechanism that Serendib Assets is really looking at is carbon trading. So this is our primary business, to develop projects for the issuance of carbon credits. What this is you can think of it as grant-based financing for environmental projects here. So we're not requesting any money from the government at all to do these projects. We're bringing the money, the investment, and we're getting revenue from the sale of carbon credits. Up to 40 to 50% of the revenues of these projects would go to the government of Sri Lanka. So we're not asking them for anything, but we're giving them something back, actually. So that is a mechanism that would reduce a ton of CO2 in Sri Lanka and allow another firm somewhere else, let's say in Singapore or in Korea, to emit another ton. That is a bit oversimplified because 1 ton, with the UN mechanism, what they're trying to do is, even though you reduce 1 ton, the buyer can only emit 0.8 tons approximately, so that we have an overall mitigation of greenhouse gases. So that is one mechanism that we're really looking at. Something else we're doing is looking at plastic credits, actually. So it's different from decarbonization, but the idea is that if you were to collect or recycle 1 ton of plastic in Sri Lanka, then maybe Coca-Cola or another huge manufacturer might be able to purchase those credits. Again, all of this is only viable if the buying entity, so Singapore, Korea, whoever it is, has a mandatory requirement to buy these carbon credits, to buy these plastic credits. Again, other mechanisms, I spoke of the outcome-based bond, that's something we're looking at. We're looking at transition credits. So it's a question of, how do you decommission a coal plant early, beyond its, or earlier than its useful life, and how do you issue something very similar to carbon credits based on that timeline, something called transition credits. So the government of Singapore is currently coming up with this new framework. So I would say this is crucial for Sri Lanka, because right now, with the IMF deal that we signed right before the election, we are not giving ourselves as much leeway in this restructuring as we would have wanted. And I think sustainable financing mechanisms such as a debt for nature swap, a debt for climate swap, might have been a useful mechanism to consider in our restructuring, which there was an initial discussion in April, but that did not come out in the final agreement. I think, just from a philosophical point of view, right? If you've tried one thing many times and failed, and that is traditional finance, you should not go back to the same thing, because you might end up in the same situation, right? Just looking at our neighbor, Pakistan, they have gone to the IMF 17, 18, 19 times. They're a regular customer of the IMF because they keep going through the same same scenario and they end up in the same place, right? So I think Sri Lanka right now, we found ourselves in between a rock and a hard place. And I think to come out of that, we really need to look at sustainable finance as a way to sort of leapfrog our situation and come out a lot better. So just to give you an example of what this debt financial swap is that I discussed was, it would entail the restructuring of Sri Lanka's debt. So rather than Sri Lanka giving $100, let's say, we would give our creditors $70 or $60, and the cost savings would go towards a nature project, or would go towards a project that would issue carbon credits. So not only do you have the cost savings from the restructuring, but you also have an additional revenue stream from the sale of carbon credits. So these are some mechanisms that we're really speaking to the government about actually currently, to see whether it's feasible to do. But in my perspective, I think it's a conversation that people in Sri Lanka have been much more open to having. When I came here a year or so ago, I think people were just looking for any solution that would work. So people were listening to sustainable finance ideas. Whether we continue this momentum is yet to be seen, but I'm a strong believer that it is what we need to really come out of the situation we're in, or at least explore it much more than we're doing right now. Yeah.
Okay, now let's talk about carbon trading. How do you see carbon trading as a sustainable finance mechanism? And could it play a role in Sri Lanka decarbonization efforts? And what would be needed for successful implementation?
So the economic rationale for carbon credits is to reduce emissions where it's cheapest to do so, right? So let's take two projects. One might be an agriculture project, one might be a solar power project. The cost of implementing each one is very different. So on a per ton of CO2 basis, you might have to spend $20 for the solar project, but only $5 for the agriculture project. So carbon credits, what it incentivizes is to reduce emissions where it's cheapest to do so. So we call this the marginal abatement cost curve. So for each country, for each type of sector or project, you have a list of interventions based on its marginal abatement cost curve. So countries, let's say in the West, are now towards the end of this curve, where they have done all of the, let's say, cost-effective projects, and now they're looking at very complex, very costly methods of reducing CO2, such as carbon capture or storage. I think there was the UK government recently announced over £20 billion worth of financing towards carbon capture and storage, whereas in Sri Lanka we still have other industries we can look at to reduce carbon. Again, agriculture and rice production being one. So Sri Lanka, we would be a host country for these projects to take place, and then we can sell these credits to countries like Japan, who have a strong need for carbon credits. So Sri Lanka as a host country, we're in a unique position, because for the government to meet its own NDC targets, our nationally determined contribution targets, it's estimated that we would need a cost of up to $11 per ton of CO2 to meet our own unconditional targets. So what this means is that as long as Sri Lanka were to sell its carbon credits for more than $11, the government is on the plus side. That is the general rationale. A key mechanism or a key principle of carbon trading is this idea of additionality, right? So it's environmental and financial additionality. What that means is that the project would not have happened if the revenues from carbon credits was not there. So let's say you wanted to, again, on this topic of a solar plant here, it costs you $1 million to implement, and your IRR just doesn't make sense, but you know that you have the renewable energy credits or the carbon credits from that to compensate. So you can determine by looking at the IRR whether this meets the financial, the environmental additionality, financial additionality or not. On the environmental side, what we really look for is whether this is a current policy by the government. So turning to agriculture, whether there's a particular technology or a particular mechanism that is mandated by law or mandated by Sri Lankan provinces to do that would reduce CO2. If it's not current practice, then you have met this requirement of environmental and policy additionality as well. That means as a project developer, we can go ahead and implement this project. So these standards and these rules are set by a few companies. One might be Vera, or the Gold Standard, or the Global Carbon Council. So what these companies do is that they establish carbon trading standards and carbon trading methodologies as well. So let's say, again, you want to do an agriculture project. There are specific rules to follow that are set out by these companies that I just mentioned, standard providers. But then when it comes to principles, you have other companies like the ICBMI or other firms that would really set out what these principles are meant to be. And these are followed by the UN as well. Under Article 6, you have to meet additionality. There's definitions of what a carbon credit is. It's called an ITMO in the UN circle. So the idea is that 1 ton of CO2 reduced here is equal to 1 ton of CO2 emitted somewhere else. There are some unique things you could do. So again, rather than a 1-to-1 transfer, it could be a 1 to 0.75 transfer. So overall, you're reducing CO2 or greenhouse gases in the system. So that's a little bit about the theoretical side of carbon trading and how any developer, any country can go about having a carbon trading project. I would say again, the key thing is to look at the marginal abatement cost of projects. Because if Sri Lanka again is receiving investment from any country for a carbon trading project here, it should be towards something called high-hanging fruits. So projects that are more costly to implement, and whatever is cost-effective to implement, let the government of Sri Lanka do that themselves. But everything else, because it's foreign investment, let it go towards projects that are more costly